So for now, we'll go ahead and hopefully as we go that you'll be able to unmute when I ask a bunch of questions. So the last session, one of the things that I shared was the Project Zion podcast a few minutes from that. And I hope that some of you took an opportunity to go and to listen to it because it had a lot of good information in it. One of the things that we keyed on was the feedback that came from someone who said, church doesn't feel like it's confined anymore within four walls. And Scott and Linda talked about that, and one of the things that he highlighted was, our scriptural counsel that talked about innovative approaches in a changing world. And he made the observation that they were coming alive, those words or those ideas were coming alive in a very new way in the context of the pandemic and what we're having to do. And went on to express that he hoped that we were aware of how significant that this was in the life of the church, that we were experiencing being a church in a new way, and that the implication was that not only are the online communities not going to go away even when the virus does, but that it opens doors that may help us understand in new ways and find more innovative approaches as we go forward. And that's some of what we want to talk about a little bit today. So one of the key things that we've talked about as we've talked about postmodernism and the change in our society and so on is this question about what is church. And so when we talk to lots of people who perhaps used to be part of our community and no longer are, and we ask about what's going on with them, we often hear them come back and they say, well, I'm spiritual. But what do they finish it with?
Not religious.
But not religious.
Exactly. Spiritual, but not religious. In fact, if you talk to people that are doing this, they abbreviate it as SBNRs, spiritual but not religious, because it begins to speak to a fundamental question that's in front of us. One of the biggest questions as the church goes through this transition is, what does it mean then to be the church if it's not religious? How do you be a church without being religious? What are some of the words that when people say spiritual, what are some words that come to mind? What are some qualities? What are some things that would immediately come to your mind when you hear spiritual?
Meditational.
Mm-hmm.
Unity. Unity.
Sorry? Yeah.
Inspiration.
Open and exploring.
Any others?
Community.
Connecting with spirit without necessarily defining it.
In tune with
Sensitivity to the Holy Spirit.
Finding God.
in tune with the needs of all those around you.
Okay.
Faith journey based on personal connection and experience rather than based on theology and rules. So it's more heart-based than head-based.
Okay. Anyone else?
Nature.
Well, I think that some of you probably paid attention when you saw the slide go by on Zach Mack's presentation, or you've been reading Diana Butler Bass's book, because many of you mentioned exactly the things that she's identified in her book called Christianity After Religion. And Zach had this as part of his presentation too. And so we have this set of qualities or this set of things that we associate with being spiritual. And these are the things that people identify when they are connected to say, I'm spiritual. These are the things that they connect with that experience. So now if we, on the other hand, go and look at religion, what comes to mind?
Theology.
Dogma.
Okay.
Tradition,
Liturgy.
Spiritual.
Okay.
Community.
Rules.
Institution,
Sacraments,
Okay. Any others?
Authority.
Excellent. Yeah, so those are all the kinds of things that we think of, and certainly people who are among those that are unchurched think of. And so here are some of the words that, again, from Diana Butler Bass's research, that they identify. This idea that it's driven as it's an institution, it's an organization, it has rules, there's order, there's dogma, and so on. Some of the words don't necessarily resonate with us. If you're like me, it kind of bothers you that they kind of have principles over on the religion side, because we kind of, in our tradition, because of the role that we have with our enduring principles and have seen how they've been presented in our community, we tend to think of that as being what's the right word? But it's versus having rules and dogma and so on. And so yeah, different words mean different things to people. But you can see that there's a bunch that are kind of matched. So on one hand, you have doubt versus certainty. You have nature versus the building. You have connection versus, whatever else is there. Hierarchies versus open. And so we begin to ask ourselves then, when we go to our word there that describes what Zach was talking about, this whole business of ecclesiology or ecclesiology. Everybody remember what that was?
theology of church.
Right. So it's our theology or understanding of what church is about. So one of the questions that we want to ask ourselves when we think about these different expressions of spiritual versus religion is to say, where do these belong in the church? And you may or may not be able to actually read that on the screen. Where do they fit in? Where does spirituality and religion fit in the context of the church? Where should they fit?
I think they both fit together.
Good answer. Because that's in fact, they are there. Or certainly in the best case, they're both there. And in fact, all of those things, and we could probably come up with a whole bunch of other words that would fit in there, all of those things can be, have been part of the experience of what it means to be church. And the question then is, what's the relationship between these things that seem to be on opposite poles here as I've presented them? And I think that when we look at them, we can say, well, you kind of got to have some of these things that are part of the religious experience, and yet you certainly want to have some of the things that are part of the spiritual experience. And so how do you reconcile those things? And so I'd suggest that there is and should be some kind of a healthy tension between them. The question becomes, what happens when the tension gets out of balance? And we get some very different kinds of experiences. So one way is that the spiritual part pushes the religious stuff into the background. Can anybody think of any examples where of groups or organizations or anything where that has happened?
Maybe when you, and this is no slight, but when you take yoga or any of those transcendental meditation places, they really focus on all of the spirituality of yourself, but they do not include any of that kind of dogma, and they won't even name God, really. They not all of them, and it's certainly, I'm not trying to slam them, I'm not, but it's just, that's just where it's at, I think.
Right. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, I'm not surprised that we're having trouble coming up with any.
I don't see the whole circle or oval as being black and white. There's a lot of gray area, and life changes. Like when I was a child, I needed probably in learning more of the principles and the institution and that kind of thing. But as I've got older, I've needed more of the spirituality. And so somehow they should be able to blend. There should be a way of not saying it's black or white, one side or the other, but it all comes together as part of your life journey in the church.
Right. Yeah, and that's a really good observation that in an ideal world, we might see where the church is able to offer all of these things in some kind of a healthy balance or some kind of a healthy attention where we understand all the values. The challenge, of course, is when it gets out of balance, and we get where one side or one thing is pushing on the other. And so, like you, I had kind of a hard time trying to think of any good examples, and the only one that came to my mind is a historical one. That if you study very early Christianity, this is what happened in the first, second century. With what they called Gnosticism. The Gnostics were very much a non-structured kind of thing, and there was a real sort of battle went on between Gnosticism and what became of the church. And and obviously, ultimately, the church kind of won, if you want to put it that way, that struggle. So when we take it to the extreme, we would call that kind of a mysticism, or some kind of a tradition that is very much based on some kinds of spiritual disciplines. And I think that that's what Pat was kind of getting at as you talk about yoga and some of these other things, where the focus is on the spiritual disciplines that are part of that experience. However, when we look at the other side, we could probably come up with lots of examples of where we've seen this happen, where the religion part has crowded and begun to push some of the spiritual experience into the background or off to the side. And this is more usual because it is organized and it is structured. And those things lend themselves to becoming organizations that can do this.
Lou, I think sometimes this, to go along with that, is that even our regular services, sometimes we get so tied up in having a program and maybe even some entertainment that we forget about the spirituality, which is why we're there in the first place.
Exactly. So we're gonna get to that in a couple of slides, because that's exactly where I'm hoping to go with this, is to help us understand that we need this. So in this experience, when it goes to the extreme, this is the various forms of fundamentalism that we see, where the church and its rules and its hierarchy and its orthodoxy and everything else becomes the most important thing. And so one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves when we think about those spiritual but not religious people that are out there, that we look and we say we want to be a presence in that world. In some ways, they're saying, I want these things. I want the focus to be on the spiritual, but what they see or what they perceive is that the focus is all on the religious part. And so the question that then we want to be asking ourselves is where do we fit? Where do you see your congregation on that scale? Anybody want to share or take a shot at how they would perceive? No judgment.
I'll start. My congregation is a lot closer to B than it is to D, but not as close to B as I would like it to be.
All right. Anyone else?
I think we're more like a C. Yeah, I think like an A or a C, like we're in there.
Yep.
More C.
Okay. Did you think of any other groups that would be, say, an example of a B kind of, where the focus is very much on spirituality?
Quakers.
Okay.
There's no dogma or beliefs or
Okay.
sacraments. The
So,
focus on all meetings is on meditation.
right. Okay, and what about within our own tradition, within our own example? Is there any congregations that we know of, or groups? Think about reunions. Do we have any examples of the different types?
B would be maybe healing and freeing.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I mean, by definition, they're kind of saying that's what we want to focus on because we want to provide that kind of experience. So, yeah, good example. You know, certainly in terms of we think about the congregations that we've been part of and that we perhaps have shared with us in the pandemic, you know, the Toronto congregation in the sense of, you know, they have programs where Leandro leads meditation that is not at all focusing on the religion part so much as the benefits of that. And yet they obviously try to blend them. Any other examples?
I don't know if you would say coffee and conversation group, if that would be more
Yeah,
B.
yeah, exactly. Because the focus is very much on that kind of experience.
I would think that some of the reunions would be like A, in that we want to have some spirituality, but you want to have some fun times too. And so the fun times and the spare times and some of the classes, they're educational more than they are sort of spiritual or dogma type of things.
Yeah, yeah, and that's exactly you know, part of what all of those experiences that we try to put together is to make sure that there are spiritual elements and at the same time we have some other opportunities. Now,
I think it also depends upon where we come from ourselves. What is our lens
exactly.
from growing up? Do I see myself as a spiritual person? Well, then things gravitate far more to the spirituality. Do I see myself as the religion is it? And so we can be giving our own bias towards this and not truly being, I'm not even sure what it is, just our own lens filters it.
Exactly. I was just about to say that, so thank you, Daryl. Because for many of us, certainly for me, to sit through a class and learning something to me is extremely spiritual, as opposed to someone else might see that as, oh, that's dogma or indoctrination or whatever else. And so, yes, exactly as Daryl articulated very well, we bring our lenses to this challenge. And so the question for us as congregations, the question for us as disciples is, whose lens do we want to see through?
and Lew, I'm wondering too, that maybe looking through the lens of an individual or a group lens has a play here.
Yeah. So one of the questions that we can think about that in terms of our own congregations and our own experience and what we're offering. And then as Joan pointed out, there are other groups out there in the world. And we would ask, where are we as a church, as a world church? And again, we could go through and we could find examples of this or examples of that would support one way or the other. I think it's safe to say that how we have experienced the church really does cover or color how we see this spectrum. If we go, for instance, to a culture like India and experience and try to understand through their lens, they will see it in a very different way than we will as middle class white North Americans. And so part of the challenge of being a world church, as I'm sure most of you can appreciate, is that it's very difficult to be all things to all people when we have such diversity. At the same time, that diversity allows us to begin to appreciate how these things look. And so, at the same way, the question is, what do we do as congregations and as disciples so that we are actually seeing some of these things through another person's lens as opposed to our lens? How many people have read or gone to a class? We were introduced to it by Daryl and Mary, in fact, about the 5 love languages. Is that a familiar concept to a lot of you? Any of you?
Yeah, we did the same weekend that you did.
So essentially, the love languages basically says that we as individuals, we hear that we are loved in different way than our partner might. And so part of then what it means to be a couple is that we in fact try to tell our partner that we love them in the language that they hear and that they like. And in a way, we're being asked to do the same thing as a church, is to say, how do we tell people that they are loved, that they are cared for, that they are welcome, that they are invited, and that we'd like them to be part of it? And so it helps if we recognize that not everyone hears or sees, or whatever metaphor you want to use, things the same way that we do. It also then we can ask the question, I just chose this one, the spirituality and religion, because I wanted to tie it back to that world out there of people saying that they're spiritual but not religious. What are the other scales that we might want to measure against, that we might want to look at and say, how do we as a church fit? What are some of the other things that you would put on that scale?
I would guess that one of the things that some churches do is allow the people to participate and to take leadership roles and to do all kinds of things. Whereas some others, they are so cut and dried that it's only one person that talks and one person makes all the decision and the rest just go and sit in the pews and leave.
Right. So one of the measures then is kind of that participatory, how much are you how much are people engaged or invited to be engaged? Any others?
Lou, I'm thinking that whole list that you had, we could do. We could do the spiritual, we could do the religion, and we just go down there and just do the back and forth.
We could.
I can't remember the actual author of this book, but it came out many years ago, and it was the 4 spirituality types.
Mm-hmm.
Recognizing that each person in a very generalized way is either A, B, C, or D type of thing, and then appreciating that despite what ours is or mine is, recognizing that and try to be inclusive enough to suppress mine for the sake of the other groups, or being aware of there's other groups besides my style.
Right. And then I know that in our congregation, we did something, there was 4 colors, there were greens, golds, and purples, and I was a green. That's all I remember. But it expresses that whole idea that because we are different and we see through a different lens, we're going to look at everything that happens, whether it's in our life or in the church or in our congregation, through different lenses. And so the people that we're reaching out to are also going to see through those lenses.
So can I make an observation in here? And Daryl, it's Corinne Ware is
Oh,
the
yes. Thank
author
you.
of that book.
Thank you.
So, and I think this is a really important concept. So in Korean Ware's 4 types, you've got the mystics, who are the spiritual, and the heart-based and the kingdom building people and all that kind of stuff. But when she's talking about the mystics, that's not necessarily spiritual, but not religious. That's spiritual and religious. And there's a big difference between having a mystical or spiritual orientation and also believing the theology, the dogma, and buying into the rules, and being spiritual but not accepting the theology, the dogma, and the rule. And to me, that's where we have the biggest challenge.
Mm-hmm. Susan?
One of the things that stuck with me, what Zach was saying, was we see things from where we're sitting. So it's important that we see our blind spots first. And that's where a lot of the spiritual practices are coming out now, so that we can look inward to see, do we have prejudices? Are we, like, how are we viewing? Because speak to our context, how I'm a white woman and living in a privileged country, so I have my biases. So and that was one thing I thought of. And the other thing I thought of, when I see spiritual and religious, I don't see them as 2 different things. And that's where I'm coming from, right? Which, so those questions you're giving were really hard for me to talk about, because it's the same thing to me.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I feel the same way, because I want to kind of say to people, no, church doesn't have to be that way. Because we say, hey, we've had this different experience, and yet how do you get somebody to appreciate or engage when their experience was extremely different from yours? And that's always going to be a challenge. Yeah, that's a really good observation.
There's a skill in the blending of the 2. And I go back to the different spiritual ways that we go into a worship service also. And worship planning can be a part of all of those things during that service that will meet the needs of the different kinds of people that are there. We just need to understand what those definitions are of how they receive worship. At Grand Valley, we've introduced Jan Kosleg is in our congregation, and he's a bit of a mystic and deeply spiritual in many ways. And so he has brought things into our service, but not the whole service. It's just, a part of it, like Leandro does with his meditations. So if we can do it gracefully and smart, in a smart way, I think they can be blended quite nicely in our congregations.
Yeah. Jim?
If you go back to that graph that you had with the 4 lines on it, what I see in that graph is tension. Tension is because if they're 4 individuals, if they're represented, say they're represented by 4 individuals that are at different points on a spectrum, right? When you put them in an organization or a room, right, it creates tension because they all want to go in different directions. And sometimes what accentuates the tension is that a person is sometimes forced into a role that they may not like in a church, and that role becomes a dominating role. So if for example, my wife happens to be on the building committee, and she spends a lot of time doing the building committee stuff, so that it shrinks her spiritual capacity to a certain degree. So that creates tension. And the question is, or some of the point is, that when a person's tension gets to a certain point, they have a tendency to want to leave, right? They don't know how to, it's how to mix those things, right? Some people don't need to belong to a church that's a building. I'm thinking, I had Ed Guy in my classroom one time, and he was an absolutely phenomenal individual, but he was, to me, totally spiritual and didn't worry about the physical aspects of a church and operation and getting people together and different things. So I see one of the problems that we have is how to manage the tension between people that are coming from different ways. The same as you had the 5 love languages. There's a lot of tension builds up because people don't see the same event in the same way.
Exactly. Okay. Which is right?
Well, none of them are right.
Exactly. They're just different, right?
Right.
Correct? So part of our challenge then, as we think about, again, this whole process of what are we learning? What are we going to do? How do we filter? How do we come up with something that we can take away from this experience of going through the pandemic and so on? Is we need to kind of have some mechanism, some way to have a conversation with our congregation, with whatever group we're in, like we are now, about who we are and where we are. Think about the conversation that we would have if, as a result of our doing online stuff, we suddenly had people coming to be part of our community from Africa or from India or from French Polynesia. Our ability to have this conversation becomes infinitely more challenging because we become really aware that we don't see through the same eyes. And yet the reality is that even the however many we got here, the 15, 17 of us, if we were to have a discussion about some things, we would find out that we're all over the map. I remember one time in our conversation, we did a thing about communion. And there were like 9 of us. Well, we kind of had 9 definitions of what we were doing. And yet, when it was done, we said the prayers, and as a community, we shared in that experience. And for me, it was enriched by the fact that we had all these different understandings of it. But so somewhere in there, we have to be prepared to deal with all of those differences, and yet somehow kind of say, gee, what can we take away from this? How can we, how should we be prepared to respond to the fact that if we keep doing online things, for instance, that means certain things over here. Or if we do this, that means different things over here. Daryl and Joan were talking about the different spiritual types. So for instance, one of the things that I've become much more aware of, being married to one and have a son who is a very much an introvert, is beginning to realize, for instance, how much the church, our church experience, what it says about how it values extroverts versus introverts. And so we could again find a whole bunch of scales where we could say, how do we provide interesting? How do we provide meaningful? How do we provide this kind of thing to understand who we are and who we appeal to and who we might want to appeal to? So again, go back to the question that we started here. What are the other scales that might be that you think would be useful?
I think that somehow, I don't know what kind of a scale you'd call it, but the tradition that we have grown up with. And I keep thinking about the people in India who grew up in a caste system where they were bound for generations and generations. And all of a sudden, the church comes along and says, you don't have to do that anymore. You got to hope to become equal with brothers and sisters all over the world. I don't know how they can even manage the thought of what it used to be like and what opportunities they have now with the church, for example. And I guess that's why there's so much strife in some of those places, because some of the adults and the older people just can't get their head around that. So I don't know what kind of a scale you'd measure that on, but I think tradition within families and in units and countries have to be a barrier in some way. So if the scale was a good or bad thing, I would think that would be a very difficult thing to overcome.
Joan?
Oh, I was going to say, I don't know what you would call this scale, but when I look at the spiritual and religious versus the spiritual but not religious, which I think is really what we're trying to come to grips with in terms of, how do we move into the current North American cultural context. The scale I look at is how much of our programming or activities in our congregation requires that you buy into certain beliefs. Because that's really for me, the crux of the issue. If you're spiritual and you believe in the theology, the dogma, the basic beliefs of the church, then you're probably quite comfortable in a worship service singing the hymns and listening to the sermon and all that kind of stuff. But if you're spiritual but do not believe the same things that the majority of church people believe, then there's absolutely no value to you in an activity where you sing hymns that you don't believe the theology, and you engage in other practices and sacraments that you don't believe the theology around. So I know this is a long explanation for a short scale, but I'd like to see a scale of what percentage of our activities together as a community require that people buy into the beliefs and the theology.
Yeah. Interesting perspective, because it and yet the thing that they originally came in contact with, and maybe because there's a soup kitchen or something where everybody's working, that is still of value to both of those groups. It's only the other part that becomes the issue. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that was kind of the implication that we take away from that, is that not everyone will care about those other things. And yet there will be some who will ask the question, why? As in, why do you people do this? Susan?
I think it's also, and I don't want to use generational, when I think of myself as spiritual and religious, going to a traditional worship service, I'm so bored. So even though I enjoy community of Christ, the enduring principles, the theology, all that. I'm just, I don't get too much out of listening to someone stand in front of me and giving a sermon. And I'm not really even enjoying music, but I enjoy the sharing with the community and the mission, like the action part of religion. And there was a book Zach recommended and I bought and just read it, and it's on leadership in the 21st century. It's by Henry Newen, a really good book. I'll put that plug in for him, to help us that when we're in the leadership roles, that just another perspective, because not everybody 60 and 70 years old enjoys church the way we've always done it, just like a 20-year-old might not. So I see the growth happening. So I enjoy this online stuff.
Jim, did you have something?
Well, basically, it was the same statement. If you wanted to refine your original comparison between spirituality and religion, you could add variables to it, like the age of the people that participate. We've already talked about the cultural background and the differences, but how do you appeal to somebody that is coming from outside the church, when a lot of the artifacts that we use, I use that term, are something that appeals to us? Joy, for example, go back in 3 or 4 or 5 generations of ancestors in the church. And when she sees something, she sees that event. When I sit in the church in New Liskeard, and I look at various items in the church, I think of what happened on a specific day, the baptism of my son. So I bring in a historical baggage to that. Baggage is the wrong word. A historical understanding of what happened in that event. So I like that. Or a person that's been in any congregation in the province in a building for a long period of time identifies with something that has happened in the past, where the new person does not have that. And how do you appeal to that generational divide? How do you get a young person, right, whether they're 30 or 20 or 10, to be interested in religion and spirituality, as we see it?
Pat?
That I'm glad you said that, because I think one of my worries, I guess, we've been given maybe a bit of a gift here. This pandemic has allowed us to sort of step out of the box pretty immediately, like not just waiting for somebody to do something, but we had to do something, and we did something, and it's great. And I think I've heard so many people not have said, this is awesome, and I'm so bought into this, and I enjoy it so much. And other people have said, I can't wait to get back to normal and that tradition, and I'm missing this, and I lost connection, and I guess my fear is I don't want to slide back into what was normal. And one woman said, I don't even like that term, new normal. But I want a new normal. I don't want that normal. I want a new normal. And I think I understand the tradition, and I get what you're saying about the age groups and how do we meet all these needs. And I empathize with some of my older congregation where they haven't been online and they've missed all of it. But I wonder, how can we find this balance that will entice new people to kind of have a new perspective of it, and yet meet I don't know how you meet everyone's needs. Can you meet everyone's needs? I don't think we ever have, but I think, it's just, I just want this new normal to not go away. I just think it's important.
Okay, great. Mary Jean?
Yeah, I struggle with this, what we've been talking about what seems to me like creating a space for the spiritual but not religious among us within our congregations, within our boundaries. And the one thing that they fight the most, you know, the boundaries. And so, and like Pat said, how do you create a space that's big enough for everybody? There are some very big differences that I'm sure that the traditionalists are not going to buy into. Are you going to buy into I can't even think, crystals and just drumming or yoga or, you know, what all of these things? There's going to be a real tension if we try to do that on both sides. And so I'm not sure that we can do that. But the other thing is too that those who are spiritual but not religious are quite happy, you know, where they are. It's not like we have to save them, you know. They have found their spiritual path, a lot of them. And so they're off doing what they want to do and really don't need the structure that other people do need. So can we allow them to be who they are? And even if they want to be under the umbrella of Community of Christ, can we allow that? Can we allow them to be totally different than what our congregations might look like?
Exactly. So that's perfect, because that's kind of where I wanted to get us to. Okay, is to I mean, just look, we're one screen's full worth of people, and yet you've heard very different and divergent needs and opinions and everything else that's out there. And so I think mostly no, let me back up. One of the takeaways that I can certainly take away is to say that what the pandemic has forced us to do by going online makes us realize that, gee, we can build communities of people who care about these things. We can build communities of people who care about those things. When we ask about things that people didn't miss about actually going to church, was one of the expressions was, I don't have to participate in everything just because it's going on at the church. You know, certainly when I was growing up, if the door of the church was open for whatever event, we were there. Okay, now whether any of us cared about some of those events wasn't the issue. You went because it was there and you supported it. Well, that worked in a certain way, but in other places it doesn't work. And so when and again, I'll just speak for myself, but when I look back now at, for instance, the whole creating connections experience that CEM has been experimenting with, and with these new expressions of congregations, it's kind of like, hey, those were doing exactly the things that we're talking about. It's like, no, they aren't going to be in the pews, because that is how does the life of the church intersect with a bunch of people who are never going to have their butts in pews beside me? And so all of those different expressions, when you then take them, they were kind of real in the sense that they were there, but now we also kind of layer in gee, we're now much more willing to think about how do we connect online communities as well. It suddenly says, gee, we can have all kinds of communities that could be developed for people who want to do this or whatever. Susan.
I'm looking for an answer to a question, and it's for, I think a lot of us are in the leadership of our congregations, and this year definitely will be quite different regarding mission. And I'm just wondering, is CEM working on a discernment process? I know there's that great on seaofchrist.org communal and personal discernment guide, but I think some of our congregations are needing to ask, you know, where do we go now? And we need to, I think, I would like to be able to be involved in a discerning process. And are there qualified people? I don't know if that's 70 evangelists that can help congregations kind of at times it seems a little overwhelming, but I know it's doable. But are there people out there waiting to be asked to be of assistance to congregations that are wanting to discern what are we doing in 2020 and 2021, even if it's online?
Daryl?
I just had I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I was interested in what Susan had said and Pat said, and then Mary Jean said. So it's kind of a combination of those last three speakers. I liked what Susan talked about, and I think is key for me between spiritual and religious, when she used the word community. I can be very comfortable in both sides of that coin, so to speak, only because of community, because of those who were there, those whom I appreciate, seeing them, whether it's creating connections that are total strangers to me and a completely different style of sharing. I just gobble that up. I love it. On the other side of the coin, the religious aspect, it's community that feeds me, and I appreciate Susan saying that. Pat was talking about listening to all these different folks, or something to that aspect. How do we do that? And it's not one of these, I forget Lew what your one question was asking, scales, but in Stephen Covey's Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, the one that always sticks out in my mind is seek first to listen before being understood, or to share yourself. It's in that community, listening and openness that has sort of echoed with myself in that. And then Mary Jean talked about, and Mary, I'm not sure how you finish this. You said something about, can we allow them, and I didn't get the last part of what you were saying, can we allow them? But you can pitch that in just a second, Mary. But my gut reaction was, will we allow them? And I forget what that phrase was. Or do we even want to allow them? Which brought us back to Lew's conversation or comment that for those of us, I'm looking on the screen right now, that have come on week after week, this is feeding us. Those who are not being fed in this kind of a style or format, they just don't come on. And that's okay too. There's no, as you said, Lew, there's no rights, there's no wrongs. It's a matter of listening one to another and celebrating our differences. So I guess the three keywords for myself is listening, talking, and celebrating those differences. So it's just a scramble of last few speakers' comments that I appreciated hearing about.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for Mary, but I think she used the word space, making space for people.
That's right. Yes.
Is that all right, Mary? Is that?
Yeah, allowing them their own place. in the secular world, I mean, if you like bowling, you're gonna go hang out with bowlers. If you like yoga, you're gonna go to a yoga class. And maybe you don't like bowling, so you will never go bowling, but you'll go to yoga, kind of thing. And so you find people that you have interests in with. And so can we allow those people to find their own path, to find their own spiritual path, to be their own spiritual path? Can we accept that their spiritual path, their journey is different from yours?
Celebrate it.
Celebrate it.
Kathy?
And with the access to all of the things that we have online, I think it's easier for someone to find a home, with people that do speak to however they are thinking, or the view that they're looking through. And I want to say too that I'm a homework person. So Lew says a question. I mean, I'm in. I mean, I'm doing my homework. So I mean, I'm writing stuff. That's just who I am. But this week I was thinking a lot about I write things down. So bear with me. In my experience and through my lens, it's not a question of building or no building, working in the community beyond the walls versus working within the community within the walls. For me, it's about being openly expectant that the Spirit is offering us opportunities, and to be willing to risk grabbing onto those opportunities, whatever they are. And I don't control what is being offered. And for me, it's not about figuring it out. Every time I say, oh, I got to figure this out, I stop myself, because it's not me figuring it out. That's tended to be really bad for me. Every time I've tried to figure it out on my own, I've stopped looking for things that I should do, or when someone shoulds on me, that doesn't work, I get turned right off. I have found that waiting and watching and listening works better for me. That goes back to what Daryl said. I sense the possibility being offered. I get a feeling, I get a joy, or I get a darkness that tells me whether I'm on the right path. And I risk to grab it. And then I enjoy those blessings that we talked about last week too.
I don't know how to mark that homework, but it sure sounded great to me.
Bruce?
Get your red pen out.
Yeah, no, that's great. There was a couple of things that Kathy said in there that I think are really, really key. I hope I can remember them. But that idea of getting away from the shoulds. And some of that is what we're talking about here. When we talk about the religious part, is that trying to fit certain people into the should world, which some of us are quite happy with and fit in, that's a very different experience. One of the other things that you said about discernment is, it doesn't matter about, at some level, it doesn't matter about buildings or not buildings or this or not that. And yet, I got some more slides here because those are going to be some questions that we do want to ask. Okay? Not that it's the be all and the end all, as Kathy just said, but at the same time, we do want to ask those questions. And so I hope, Susan, in your discussion about discernment, you heard, there's kind of this flow that sometimes goes that, whether you're asking about the shoulds, what should we be doing as a congregation? What should I be doing as a disciple? Versus listening for that Spirit to move us. Okay? And again, there's a number of different places in the last few weeks that I've kind of heard those messages in a couple of the sermons on Behind the Wall and a couple of podcasts that we've listened to and so on, of saying, maybe we need to just step back from the should part and just let it. Not to say that we don't actively engage in paying attention to what's going on around us, to actively saying, how is this different? How can we learn something from this? But it's about having the pressure of the shouldness that sometimes kind of gets in our way. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, Kathy, but I see you nodding. So.
Yeah, that was it, Lou. I have a friend, Robin, who says, don't should on me.
Yeah.
Right? We should be doing this. Oh, guess what? Kathy's gone. Don't should on me.
Yeah. Jim?
I like Mary's comment. I think we have a tendency to want to attract somebody and keep them, right? And sometimes people are just on a spiritual journey and they stop at our place for a little bit to see what we have, and then we go on. I remember listening to the President Veazey, and he had gone to some weird, I'm going to call it a weird conference, up in Seattle, so it had to be weird. But he went to a conference someplace, which was outside of our normal realm, to see what they had, to see if he could pick up something, to see if there was something in their perspective that would help him understand our perspective. And then he moved on, right? He didn't stay there, right? And if we look at on our spiritual journey, sometimes people will just intersect for a period of time. There'll be an interplay where we both learn something, and then we'll go off in different directions. We don't have to try to keep everybody that comes in.
Ruth, did you have a comment?
Okay.
Here you go. Yep.
Go for it.
Just going back to where Daryl was for a few minutes. Thank you, Daryl. I was thinking one of the things too, he mentioned community, and within that community, I think there's communication. You know, we have to be able to have a conversation with one another within the church. Even the people who ordinarily sit in the pews, even the people who are ordinarily in leadership. I think communication is so important, to be able to sit down and let people express themselves and where they are right now and what is meaningful to them right now. And that won't always be the same. That will change. It will depend on where their life is right now. But I think to offer people opportunity to just give expression to what they're thinking, what they're feeling. I am sometimes amazed. We have a number of young people in our congregation. I say young, they're 50. they're in their late 40s, right, or early 40s. And I'm amazed. I'm amazed sometimes at what they are really feeling deep down in their heart. We might assume other things of them, and yet they have something very rich and telling within them. And so I think in order to be community, we have to communicate. And sometimes that's hard. You know, people are afraid to really express what is on their minds right now within the church. What's troubling them? What ministers to them? What has meaning for them? And I like what Anne said earlier. She said, you know, there was a time in my life when this was important to me. This was my basis. This is what grounded me. But now there's something else, you know, kind of evolving within my spirit. So we all change, but I think that being able to communicate is so important, and it's one of the hardest things to do, to be honest with one another. Yeah.
Being honest, I want to piggyback a theme with you, Ruth, now. Being honest from my perspective is that even though I'm now retired, I'm still in that rat wheel of busyness. And I just for whatever reason, just don't slow down enough to take the time to listen. That's, I think, our North American society. Daryl's perspective is that it's not that I don't want to, or we don't want to, but we just don't prioritize. I just don't prioritize that as what I should, and that's probably just me. But I don't think we as a society will take that time to listen to those folks, any of the folks.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we probably need to state explicitly is that when we talk about our lives intersecting with these different communities, with the spiritual but not religious, the spiritual and religious, the people who love tradition and all of that, the fact that we do need to communicate with them, but the primary thing that we need to communicate is that we care. That we care. That's why we're in community. And again, I wonder sometimes if we get caught up in all of the other stuff, beliefs, dogma, tradition, and sacraments, and ritual, and liturgy, and hymns, and theology, and we forget that over and over again, when you hear the testimony of someone, what do they say? They were loved into the church. It was simply because somebody cared, simply because somebody told them that communication part that said, yeah, we got some differences, we got this, but I care about you. And somehow all of these things that we might do, that we might change, hopefully are grounded in that basic premise that that's kind of what we're about, is being a safe place, of having that place where we communicate and talk with each other. I saw a hand there, I think it was Susan.
Oh, I was just going to respond to what Ruth also said, because sometimes, and I have to remember this, when you're in leadership, sometimes, you have to make sure you're not in control, and you need to humbly listen to other people, and sometimes that need for control or, directing can get in the way of not really hearing them.
Kathy?
I came across something just recently, and it's ARE, appreciation, recognition, and encouragement. And those three are so important, and especially right now through this COVID-19, that we tell people, even when you have a family together like mine, we have 5 people in our household. I'm the one that's here at this class. If somebody expects that my children, how old they are, they're adults, are taking this in because I'm here, somebody is missing out the boat here. That everyone needs to have someone who appreciates, recognizes, and encourages them.
Okay.
Picking up on what Susan said, somebody once told me presiding over a meeting doesn't mean, like Susan said, that you're in charge, that you're running it, that you're doing everything, that you're following the schedule that's been set out. You discern what is happening around you, the people that are around you in that meeting, and if you feel something is needed outside of whatever the program is set up to be, then you step into that.
Yeah, and I have to keep remembering it's not me, it's God. I'm not doing it. Yeah, it's puts a whole new perspective on things. Yeah.
Yeah, it does, because you know, I have this conversation with people, especially when they have their first priesthood call. You know, the part of the conversation is about, you know, we are not responsible for the outcome of our ministry. That's between other people and God. And what we are responsible for is responding to the needs that we see in front of us and the people that we intersect and that our lives intersect with. And in that response, we also need to remember that we didn't get there first. You know, that God was there working in lives long before we showed up. And so part of how we respond to the changes we're talking about, whether it's the big shift of postmodernism or the more local stuff that we've learned about the pandemic and so on, is to be asking, what is this telling us to do? What is this experience? What are the new things that we've heard? What are the new things that I'm feeling? What are the new things that I'm encouraged to do? What is God inviting me to do? What is God inviting us to do out of this experience? Yes, we may also want to put on our big philosophical hat and say, what are the big trends that are happening out there and so on? But at the same time, we also just want to ask ourselves that question, gee, since we've been meeting online, I have felt this over and over again. What is God inviting me to do as I experience that? I really miss something about what we used to do. What am I being invited to do with that knowledge? So I've got a bunch of other things that I want to talk about next week, and some of them are probably some of the should type questions where we do want to ask in our congregations. We at least want to think about our personal role of saying, how do I think about this stuff so that when my congregation is ready to have that conversation, I've got something to say? How do I think about this? How might I encourage someone else in my congregation to think about it in a different way? And so those are some of the questions that we do want to ask next time. We want to ask about, you know, some of the things about how would we not so much the mechanics of going through the process, but what are some of the questions we want to ask ourselves as congregations, as disciples? What are some of the evaluations? How do we change how we measure things? Is some of what I understand about how I see things changing out there because I have a certain measuring stick in my head? And if I change the measuring stick, do I suddenly look at it and say, oh, that's really successful when I look at it through that lens? So that's some of the things that I hope that we'll get on to the next time. Not going to have any answers, but hopefully we're going to bring some more questions that we can at least be thinking about, that we can share with each other, and then share as we respond and ask ourselves, who else should I be sharing some of this stuff with? Who else should I be having these conversations with? It's not as wonderful as it is for us to talk together. Hopefully we have could make some ripples in the ponds in which we have our little lily pads here, and engage with other people as we ask some of these questions and go through this process. So again, thank you very much. It's 8:30. I'm happy to stay around and chat if anybody has more things to talk about, but otherwise we'll look forward to seeing you next week.